In 1927, a proclamation was signed by A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector of Aborigines, making it unlawful for Aboriginal people to visit or remain in the city of Perth. This prohibited area stayed in effect until 1954, and the Aboriginal people still remember the impact it had on their community.
Actually, we tend to refer to them as the out of town by 6 o'clock laws, because basically most people knew that after 6 o'clock you just weren't allowed to be in town.
This is about Aboriginal people not being allowed into what was originally supposed to be the centre of Perth.
Police, publicans, train conductors, anyone in any kind of authority felt they had the right to tell an Aboriginal person to get out of town. In particular, before then, people were attending in the 1920s a place called White City, which was right down on the foreshore in Perth. It was run by a group called the Uglymen Society, and they were a group of returned soldiers, and it was to raise funds for families of returned soldiers. And it was an amusement centre, and it had buck jumping and boxing competitions and these giant slides and bands, and you could perform a number of things as participants. It was kind of like a sideshow alley in Perth, but it attracted a lot of people, black and white. But the particular problem for the department was that it was attracting Aboriginal people, in particular Aboriginal men and women, who were both fraternising with non-Aboriginal people, which was frowned upon, but were just highly visible, and that troubled Mr. Neville, the Chief Protector.
And that's kind of what Neville's focus was to keep Aboriginal people away from boxing rings and some of the activities down at White City. I don't think he actually realised the full extent of the city of Perth, which in fact in those days extended right through to the coast and a lot of the metropolitan area. So between 1927 and 1948, Aboriginal people were not allowed in that area unless they were issued a pass, unless they had what was called lawful reason to be in that area, if they had work and so on. So as a result, quite a few Aboriginal people were confronted by police who were patrolling the area and often charged, sometimes imprisoned for a short spell, simply being in that prohibited area.
You can actually look up and check for arrests for cohabitation at that time in WA, and there were lots of arrests. People were arrested, these laws were enforced, and people might find themselves fined a significant amount of money or in prison for up to 2 weeks for being found in contravention of the Act.
In 1947, 1948, that area was reviewed, and I think it was, if you read the file, it seems apparent that there was some confusion as to the boundary of the area, and the government of the time realised maybe there was a bit of a mistake made in 1927, and they reduced the boundary of that area to more the Perth CBD component. I think it's because when previous researchers have looked at the file, it shows the boundary on a map of the prohibited area in sort of red ink. But people have been working off what's called a microfilm copy of that record, which is purely black and white. So it's very hard to see what the full boundary was unless you're looking at a colour copy of that file.
So the prohibited area was actually abandoned, or it was finally revoked by the governor in 1954. Now that had come after a dedicated campaign by the Coolbaroo League in particular, to Parliament and to the Department of Native Welfare to change that law, to have it removed. It was considered to be something of the past and something that was no longer necessary.
It's marginalising Aboriginal people without a doubt. It was really a form of segregation, in my opinion, in the fact that it was so heavily regulated and controlled. So the lives of Aboriginal people were incredibly regulated and controlled compared to a white person who could go about his or her business in a fairly free manner.
I think it's really important to understand our history, and I think it's important because while each crop and each generation comes to understand its history from a particular perspective, so too is there a consistent forgetting. We can't know everything. So we need to make sure that if we are learning from our past, that we are consistently retelling it, because each generation comes through and it needs to be told the story of its history.